metaphysical character of the substratum created and conserved in the later theory. Regarding the relation between created noumena and empirical reality, the critical philosophy maintains that, quote, no one can have the slightest knowledge whether the supersensible underlying the appearance of a body is composite or simple as thing in itself, end quote. What is essential to Kant's practical dogmatic metaphysics is that distinct moral agents at the empirical level are nominally distinct. What's important for present purposes is that the critical philosophy continues to describe conservation as broadly symmetrical with creation and both as directed towards the causally active substratum of empirical reality. Lectures presented after the appearance of the Critique of Pure Reason describe conservation as a divine action, quote, in the innermost component, das Innerste of substances. That is the substantial, das Substantiale, our first principle of action of substances. We're told that without God's unceasing and essential actuation of the substantiale of things in the world, these things must cease to exist. While Kant continues to present creation and conservation as essential components of his moral theology, the Perpetual Peace passage cited above shows that he regards divine concurrence as competing with naturalism regarding secondary causation in a way in which creation and conservation supposedly do not. His concurrentist predecessors would respond that this objection conflates a general metaphysical condition for the efficacy of creaturely powers with miracles or violations of the natural order. Kant evidently sees no conflation. He claims repeatedly that all concurrences is miraculous, that every case in which God acts immediately in nature is an exception to the laws of nature. From the concurrentist perspective, this begs the question against the doctrine that secondary causation rooted in creatures' natures requires concurrence as condition of its natural efficacy. In effect, Kant charges the concurrentist doctrine of immediate divine action in nature with the error Leibniz attributes to occasionalism, that of appealing to miracles which are no less miraculous for being continual. So adjudication of this dispute requires consideration of further arguments on both sides. Kant is unlikely to be moved by an argument offered by Suarez in favor of concurrence proceeding from the mechanics of so-called contra natura miracles, those in which the miraculous effect goes against a natural disposition of creatures. Suarez notes that the concurrentists can, for example, explain God's holding back the effects of the Babylonian fire in the book of Daniel as a withholding of concurrence with the fire's natural powers, without which cooperation the fire can affect nothing. The mere conservationist lacks this mechanism, and Suarez argues must describe God's action in contra natura miracles as thwarting the natural activity of fire, as it were from without, down fire, something like that. And Suarez rejects such acting against creatures as unbecoming to the absoluteness of divine sovereignty. He argues that the doctrine of concurrence gains an important advantage here by admitting a metaphysical symmetry between God's ability to annihilate creatures merely by withholding his conservation and his ability to, quote, deprive a created entity of its natural action merely by withholding concurrence. Kant doesn't consider that argument. I don't know if he would be impressed by it. He does consider and reject another argument for concurrence often employed in the schools. Its central idea is that a proper understanding of conservation reveals the necessity of an immediate divine action in all natural effects. We saw a similar claim in one of Malebranche's arguments for occasionalism. Malebranche argues that God's giving of being must involve the ways of being, since the ways of being are nothing but beings themselves in this or that fashion. The concurrentist seeks to infer divine immediacy in all natural effects on these grounds, while avoiding Malebranche's conclusion that God produces everything and creatures nothing. Leibniz gestures at such an argument when he writes that, quote, one cannot say what to conserve is without reverting to the general, that is to say, concurrentist opinion. It must be taken into account that the action of God in conserving should have some reference to that which is conserved. Arguments from demands of conservation to concurrence are also seen in Suarez, Wolff, Baumgarten, and Meyer. Suarez says, quote, if it's not the case that all things are affected immediately by God, then neither is it the case that they are conserved immediately, given that an entity is related to its esse in the same way that it's related to its being made. For an entity's esse cannot depend more on an adequate cause after it has come to be than it did while it was coming to be, end quote. His idea is that if a creature can produce any effect whatsoever without God's immediate assistance, then that effect does not depend on an immediate divine conservation at the moment of its production, contrary to Suarez's understanding of divine conservation. Kant would simply grant the conclusion. since his official view is that God conserves accidents only immediately by virtue of an immediate conservation of substances in which they inhere. Both Baumgarten and Meyer likewise claim that the conservation of creaturely forces puts God into an immediate causal relation with natural effects of these forces, thus with all effects of secondary causes. On one recent interpretation of Leibniz's model of divine concurrence, he has something similar in mind. Adams suggests, Bob, that Leibniz's association of concurrence with demands of conservation might be understood as claiming that, quote, this is Bob, not Leibniz, what God directly produces, we may say, is not just the creature's nature and its affections and actions, but the creature's nature operating and thus producing its affections and actions. In thus producing the creature's producing, God's conserving activity has a direct causal relation to the creature's actions, but without excluding the productive agency of the created nature. It seems to be the case that the German rationalist interpretation of Leibniz was led to a similar interpretation of his views about concurrence. The main problem for this proposal, I think, is the danger of collapsing concurrence into mere conservationism. Suarez objects that Durandus's conservationism fails to maximize divine sovereignty by denying a further action of God in and with all agents. If the immediacy of God's action in concurring reduces to God's producing creatures producing, then Durandus is at worst guilty of failing to grasp an immediacy of divine action which his own doctrine of conservation entails. Kant, at any rate, evidently accepts the characterization on which divine concurrence is supposed to be something over and above mere conservation. On this understanding, the individual concurring causes, including the divinely conserved secondary cause, are regarded as individually insufficient for the effect. The concurrentist, of course, does not deny that God could produce the effect alone if he wished, but rather claims that the action by which God actually concurs is insufficient to produce it without the creature's contribution. This provides the basis for Kant's objection that conservation is not concursus because concursus is the causality of an insufficient cause providing a complementum ad sufficientiam. In light of the traditional characterization of concurrence as something more than mere conservation, part of the point of Kant's physician example is to record what he sees as the confusion in seeking to derive concurrence from mere conservation. He objects that, quote, God is the author of the physician together with all of his medicines, and so the effect must be ascribed entirely to God if one wants to ascend all the way to that highest original ground, or one can ascribe it entirely to the physician, insofar as we follow up the event as belonging to the order of nature. The same passage offers a conceptual objection to the very idea of divine concurrence with those secondary causes operating by a necessity of nature. Kant writes that, quote, to allow what is itself the complete cause of alterations in the world, supplement its own predetermining providence, which must therefore have been inadequate during the course of the world, is first contradictory, for causa solitaria non juvat, a solitary cause does not assist. Leibniz and Suarez would respond by rejecting the sense of predetermining providence implicit in Kant's argument. The objection presents divine concurrence as God's overdetermination of a natural effect through cooperation with a secondary cause which would have produced the effect in any case. Insofar as concurrentist opponents present concurrence as a condition above and beyond conservation of the efficacy of secondary causes, their idea is rather that created natures are incapable of producing anything without divine cooperation. This point is admittedly muddied by arguments in which opponents suggest that concurrence follows from demands of conservation. But once it's made clear, it's evident that the concurrentist does not understand God's predetermining providence to mean that effects would come about in any case, that is, even without the concurring act. As Suarez explains, in the case of causes operating by a necessity of nature, God concurs with them, quote, in the manner of a nature, which is to say that God's decision to create and conserve such creatures brings with it a defeasible commitment to, quote, concur with these same entities in their actions according to their capacities. So God's predetermining providence thus includes this defeasible cooperation in the ordinary course of things. It's not supplemented by it. Now, Kant's conceptual objection here might be seen as a response to the weight contemporaries place on arguments for the necessity of concurrence from demands of conservation. It might also be taken as a rejection of the coherence of divine concurrence as traditionally understood. As Freddoso explains, models of divine concurrence were traditionally viewed as having to avoid a number of pitfalls, representing significant metaphysical constraints on proposals for its operation. Two important pitfalls involve splitting the effect and splitting the action, in the sense that a distinct part of the naturally produced effect or a distinct action is attributed to the creature alone. Any model of concurrence involving such splitting violates the concurrentists' fundamental doctrine that the creature can do or produce nothing without divine cooperation. Kant offers very limited discussion of particular models of concurrent causation, and it's unclear whether he is aware of traditional worries concerning the satisfiability of the no-splitting constraint. Part of Malebranche's case for occasionalism is that divine concurrence, as an alternative account of God's relation to secondary causation, quote, appears the more incomprehensible the more effort is spent to understand it. Kant's conceptual objection might be read as reflecting agreement with Malebranche that there is no coherent concurrentist middle ground between mere conservationism and an occasionalist attribution of effects solely to God. Now, one apparent problem with this reading or this conclusion is that Kant does not reject concurrent causation per se. He allows, of course, concurrence among secondary causes. That doesn't run afoul of his conceptual objection because the co-causes are not completely subordinated to each other. But drawing on his mature libertarian metaphysics, Kant also allows for the possibility of divine concurrence with free causes. In this case, as he repeatedly argues, the creaturely causes as free are not completely subordinated to God's predetermining providence. And so his conceptual objection to concurrence with causes operating by a necessity of nature simply does not apply. Now, discussion of this issue takes me into the ambit of Kant's theory of grace, which I can only touch on very briefly here. Leibniz and Suarez distinguished the metaphysics of divine and secondary causation in the ordinary course of nature from the metaphysics of grace as a special variety of concurrence. The former is my concern here, but the issues are related, and Leibniz notes the old association of Durandus's conservationism with the Pelagian heresy. Kant's conservationism has the interesting consequence for his metaphysics of grace that he can ignore the no splitting of action effect constraint on divine concurrence as traditionally understood. For we've seen that this constraint is motivated by the concurrentists' basic idea that creatures can do or produce nothing without divine assistance beyond mere conservation, and this is a doctrine Kant clearly has given up. It follows that his admission of the possibility of divine concurrence with free acts is less of a concession to concurrence than might at first appear, since such cooperation need not meet traditional constraints on such cooperative causation. So there remains room to interpret Kant as agreeing with Malebranche that divine concurrence as conceived of in the schools is simply unintelligible. Okay, so Kant thinks in the critical philosophy it's possible to justify a conservationist metaphysics of divine and secondary causation, even in the face of his critical strictures on knowledge, of noumena. That's because the strictures do not rule out acceptance of the reality of finite agency on practical grounds, first of all. Neither do they exclude appeals to a broadly conceived naturalism in opposing the continuous interventions of occasionalism. Kant also argues by elimination for conservationism with the aid of conceptual arguments against concurrence we've just seen, though neither Leibniz nor Suarez would be very impressed by the arguments he offers. I think that's pretty clear. Both would regard his objection that concurrence violates naturalism as conflating what they present as a metaphysical condition on all secondary causation and miracles in the sense of violations of the natural order. Kant's defense of conservationism over concurrence is weakened by his failure to make this basic distinction. His own efforts to press the conservationist line on broadly naturalist grounds also remain, it seems, in some tension with his own view, his own continued commitment to the dependence of all finite existence on divine acts of creation and conservation. So in conclusion, one further complication, which I haven't gone into here, Kant's mature theory of God's relation to creaturely causality involves, by his own admission, a fundamental tension which is absent from his earliest thought. Alongside his enduring commitment to the complete ontological dependence of creatures, Kant comes to embrace a libertarian doctrine of agency on which free acts are not completely fixed by God's predetermining providence. And his late writings openly acknowledge the resulting tension. He says, "For to be a creature, and as a natural being, merely the result of the will of the Creator, yet to be capable of responsibility as a freely acting being, one which has a will independent of external influence, and possibly opposed to the latter in a variety of ways. But again, to consider one's own